The morning of my wedding, my father stood at the entrance of the venue, smoothing the lapels of his jacket, and said to my maid of honor, loudly enough for half the arriving guests to hear, that he was embarrassed to be walking his daughter down the aisle to some grunt who couldn't even afford a real ring. He hadn't looked at the invitation list. He hadn't asked about the groom's rank, his decorations, or the quiet and methodical way the man I loved had spent 11 years earning the kind of loyalty that cannot be purchased or performed. He only saw what he had always chosen to see when he looked at me, a disappointment dressed in white, making once again the wrong choice. What he did not know, what none of us could have anticipated when the morning began with birdsong and the heavy, intoxicating scent of gardenias, was that by 3 o'clock that afternoon, 150 uniformed soldiers would march through the doors of that venue in perfect formation and render the kind of salute that stops a room cold and makes even the most self-assured man in it feel, suddenly and completely, the precise dimensions of his own smallness. Not one of those soldiers would look at my father. Not one would acknowledge that he was standing there. Every eye, every sharp hand raised to every forehead in perfect synchrony would be directed at the woman in the wedding dress and at the man beside her who had spent his entire adult life earning that honor. My name is Clara Whitfield, and I grew up in a house where my father's approval was a currency distributed with the precision and deliberateness of a man who understood that scarcity creates value. Richard Whitfield was not cruel in any way that would have been obvious to a stranger. He didn't shout. He didn't slam doors. He didn't leave evidence of himself in any form that couldn't be plausibly denied. His particular method was subtler and more durable. It lived in the slight tightening around his eyes when I chose the wrong answer, in the way he redirected dinner conversation so that it never landed on anything I had accomplished, in the long pauses he inserted before saying anything about my life that were louder than anything he actually said. He was the kind of father who was present at every important moment, graduations, birthdays, holidays, but whose presence always carried a low-grade, atmospheric pressure, the way certain weather systems carry cold before they arrive. You could feel it building. It always arrived on schedule. It never left as quickly as you hoped. My mother, Ellen, had learned to navigate around him the way you learn to navigate around the furniture you've stubbed your toe on so many times that the avoidance has become unconscious. You simply adjust your path without noticing the adjustment anymore. She loved him, I believe, in the way of someone who has lived long enough inside a particular arrangement that they have ceased to imagine alternatives. She was kind and gentle and faintly sad in the way that water is sad, always taking the shape of whatever contains it. She died of ovarian cancer when I was 26, quietly in April, in the same way she had always lived, without complaint and without ceremony, asking nothing of anyone in the final months except to be allowed to go without a fuss. After she was gone, the distance between my father and me stopped growing and simply solidified into something architectural, something I stopped trying to dismantle because I had begun to understand that the structure of our relationship might depend on it. I had been living in my own apartment in Savannah for 4 years when I met James. I was working surgical intensive care at Memorial Hospital. 12-hour shifts, the particular exhaustion of work that demands your entire nervous system, the strange intimacy that forms between colleagues who have stood beside each other in the worst hours of strangers' lives. I volunteered on the fundraising committee for a veteran support organization, and it was at their October gala that I first saw him. The room was lit by candlelight, dozens of small flames on every table, casting a gold that softened everything and made the uniformed guests look like figures from a different century. James was standing near the bar, not drinking, not particularly trying to be noticed, watching the room with a quality of stillness I would later come to understand was not reserve, but depth. He was 34, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that didn't rush toward conclusions, and the kind of hands that looked like they had done real work for a long time and were not sorry about it. His dress uniform was immaculate, the creases sharp enough to be architectural, the decorations on his chest considerable without being ostentatious. He was an Army captain, James Alderman. And he had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, and he carried himself with the quiet gravity of someone who had been tested and had not been found wanting. We talked for 2 hours that October evening without either of us noticing the time go. We talked about his work and mine, the soldiers he'd lost and the ones who'd come home, but were still fighting battles that didn't show up on any scan. We talked about Savannah in autumn, about the particular quality of light on the river late in the year, about books we'd both read and couldn't agree on, about what we each did when we had silence, and how rarely that happened in our respective lives. He called me the following Saturday morning and asked whether I wanted to walk along the waterfront. The ease of it, the directness, the absence of performance, caught me so off guard that I said yes before I had finished processing the question. I knew, even that early, that this man was going to alter the shape of my life. I knew it the way you know certain things that aren't yet facts, but feel more reliable than facts, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky has changed. We dated for 18 months. In that time, I came to know his whole history. The family farm in rural Georgia, where he'd grown up helping his father, the older brother lost in a car accident when James was 19. A loss that had redirected him, quietly and permanently, towards something larger than himself. I came to know his commanding officer, Colonel Marsh, a barrel-chested man from Tennessee who told me within 5 minutes of meeting me that James was the finest officer he had ever served beside, and said it with the blunt, unadorned sincerity of a man who does not give compliments carelessly. I came to know the soldiers in James's unit, their names, their families, the particular way they spoke about their captain, which was, with a loyalty so consistent and unperformed that it functioned less like admiration and more like weather, simply present, not requiring explanation. I had never in my life felt as clearly seen, as genuinely respected, or as steadily loved as I did when James Alderman looked at me across a room. It was not the love of someone who needed me to be something. It was the love of someone who had simply decided, carefully and without drama, that I was who he wanted beside him. That kind of love is rarer than most people understand. My father's reaction to James was precisely what I had both expected and dreaded. The first time I brought James to dinner, a Sunday in March, 8 weeks into our relationship, a meal my father had prepared with the formal deliberateness he brought to everything he considered an evaluation. My father spent the first quarter hour asking questions about salary, housing allowance, military pension structures, and what he called the realistic career ceiling for someone in your position, framing each inquiry as polite interest while executing it with the cool efficiency of a financial auditor. James answered every question directly and without defensiveness or embarrassment, which seemed to frustrate my father more than evasiveness would have. When James excused himself to help clear the table, an instinct so natural in him that it appeared effortless, my father leaned across to me and said with the measured delivery of a man who has rehearsed his position, "He seems decent enough, Clara, but you understand there's no real future here. There's no money in the military, no real social standing. You could do considerably better." The candlelight between us didn't waver. My hands were in my lap. I said, "He's a good man, Dad." And my father turned back to his wine as if the matter had been considered and filed. But I understood, sitting at that table with the smell of pot roast and candle wax and my father's good intentions heavy in the air around me, that the verdict had been delivered and that he had no intention of revising it. The months that followed moved through the predictable phases of my father's disapproval in the same way weather systems move through a season, each one distinct, each one leaving something altered behind it. The first phase was the architecture of comparison. Conversations about my relationship were interrupted with the regularity of a tide by references to other men, sons of colleagues, old friends from college who had gone into finance or consulting, men whose value could be expressed in firm names and compensation packages. "Did I tell you Marcus Holloway just made partner?" he would say, in the middle of a phone call that had nothing to do with Marcus Holloway. I had barely known Marcus Holloway. I had sat beside him at a dinner party 6 years ago and found him pleasant and entirely unmemorable. But these references were never about Marcus Holloway. They were about the sustained, methodical suggestion that I had taken a wrong turn and could still, if I were sensible, be redirected. The second phase was what my best friend Diane called the infrastructure of doubt. Small observations, carefully placed and finely calibrated, designed to erode rather than demolish. I hope you understand what the military lifestyle really means for a family. Long deployments, constant relocation, no stability. It's a very hard life for a woman, Clara, and I want to make sure you've thought it through. I just want you to go in with your eyes open. Each comment taken alone could be parsed as parental concern. Accumulated over months, they built something. A low, persistent hum of pessimism inside which my happiness was supposed to feel provisional, contingent, subject to revision. I began to notice that I braced slightly before calling him. I began to notice that I always felt slightly diminished after, the way a room feels smaller after something large has been quietly removed from it. James noticed. He didn't say so directly. It was not his nature to position himself against my father, and I admired that restraint in the way you admire anything that holds its shape under pressure. But I would catch him sometimes watching me after a family call, measuring something in my expression, and once very quietly while we were standing side by side at the kitchen sink, he said, "You don't have to defend me to him, Clara. Not to him, not to anyone. I'm not going anywhere." I had to set down the glass I was holding. My hands had started to shake in the way they sometimes do when something true and overwhelming is said to, simply to defend against. I didn't tell him why. When we announced the engagement, dinner at my father's house in November, over a bottle of wine James had brought and my father had accepted without comment, my father called me alone the following morning, not to congratulate us. The conversation lasted 40 minutes and covered, in careful, measured language, every concern he had ever raised about military salaries, about the instability of base reassignments, about what he called the social limitations of marrying into a world without real upward mobility. That phrase, its precision, its cold assessment of James's worth in terms of social utility, told me everything I needed to understand about how little my father had ever tried to see the man I had chosen. He ended by saying, "I just think you deserve better than this, Clara. I want more for you than this." And I stood in my kitchen with the phone to my ear, looking out at the November garden, and I thought, "You mean you want more for yourself? You mean this embarrasses you? You mean I have failed, again, to reflect you at the angle you require?" I told him the wedding would be in May, and that I hoped he would be there. He said he would come. He did not say he was happy for me. The months leading to the wedding were a study in my father's genius for creating turbulence through implication. He asked at Christmas whether James's family would be contributing to the costs in a tone that presupposed they wouldn't or couldn't. He asked in February whether I had considered a simpler ceremony, and when I pressed him, he said, "I just think it's a great deal of pageantry for what it is." He referred to James consistently as your soldier, never James, never your fiancé, the indefinite article doing all the work of erasure the sentence required. Diane, who had been my closest friend since our first year of nursing school, and who had the particular gift of seeing things clearly that I was too close to see at all, called it slow-motion sabotage. "He's trying to make you doubt it without ever saying so directly," she said, over coffee one afternoon in March, her hands wrapped around her cup and her eyes very level and honest. He's been doing this your whole life. You just never had something this worth fighting for before." She was not wrong. The night before the wedding, my father arrived at the rehearsal dinner in a charcoal suit and the air of a man discharging an obligation. He sat at the head table. He made a toast. He raised his glass and said, smoothly and without hesitation, that he wished Clara and the groom all the best in their new life together. He did not say James's name. In front of 47 people, including James's mother, who had flown in from Georgia and who had wept when she met me and pressed my hands in both of hers, my father lifted his glass to the groom, as if the man standing beside me were a bit player in a production he hadn't chosen to attend. The silence that followed was brief and unmistakable. James squeezed my hand under the table. His grip was steady and warm and revealed nothing. I looked at my father settling back into his chair with the composed satisfaction of someone who has completed a task efficiently, and I thought, Tomorrow this becomes real and there is no more taking it back. And then, because I had learned, over 31 years, to fold certain things away and carry them quietly, I picked up my glass and drank. What I didn't know was that what my father had done in private was considerably worse than anything he had done in front of witnesses. I found out on the morning of the wedding itself in the bridal suite, 10 minutes after the makeup artist had finished my foundation, and the information hit me with the particular force of something you have half known for a long time, but refused to let yourself fully consider. The morning was warm and luminous, the kind of May morning that feels less like weather and more like a covenant. The venue was a historic plantation house outside Savannah, white columns and wide magnolia trees, and the long, sweet smell of cut grass coming through every open window. Diane had been managing the day with her customary focused efficiency since before 7, moving through rooms with checklists and quiet authority, her voice low and her direction clear. I was in my dress by 9, an ivory silk gown with a low back and a train that moved like water, sitting in front of the mirror in the bridal suite while the makeup artist worked, and the morning light came through the tall windows in long gold bars, and the gardenias on the dressing table filled the room with a scent so particular and so strong that I knew I would smell it for the rest of my life and think of this moment. It was Diane who told me. She came in just before 10, closed the door behind her with a deliberateness that made the makeup artist step back and quietly gather her brushes, and sat down across from me with her hands folded in her lap and her expression arranged into the careful neutrality she wore when she had something difficult to say and intended to say it well. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to stay very still while I tell you, because you cannot go downstairs with your mascara wrong." I set down the glass of water I had been holding. The cold in my stomach arrived before the words did, that particular premonitory chill of a body bracing for an impact it can already sense coming. "Tell me," I said. What had happened was this. Marcus Holloway. The Marcus Holloway my father had been invoking for 2 years as a benchmark against which I was meant to measure my own choices, had run into my cousin Patrick at a bar 3 weeks earlier. In the course of that conversation, Patrick had learned that my father had called Marcus privately, in January, to suggest that I was not entirely settled in my current relationship and might be open to reconnecting with old friends. My father had made that call in January of this year. We had sent save the dates in November. He had received the save the date and then, with deliberate intent, had picked up the phone and attempted to redirect the situation by offering another man a path back to me. Marcus, confused and somewhat disturbed by the call, had mentioned it to Patrick out of sheer disbelief, and Patrick, apparently operating on some residual instinct of family loyalty, had told Diane, because even the most peripheral members of my family seemed to understand that I needed to know. I sat in the chair in the gold morning light with the gardenias and the white roses of my bouquet and the sound of the distant string quartet warming up somewhere below, and I was very still. The makeup artist had gone. Diane was watching me with the careful, steady attention of someone who has decided that their function in this moment is simply to be present and solid, and not to fill the silence with anything unnecessary. Everything in the room was very clear and very quiet. My father had called another man to offer him access to me while I was writing my wedding vows. While I was tasting cake samples and choosing between ivory and cream and learning the words of a poem I planned to say to James at the altar, my father had been making a different kind of call, careful and deliberate and private, because he had never, not once, intended to accept what I had chosen. My hands were folded in my lap. My knuckles had gone white without my noticing. I could feel my pulse in my temples, slow and deliberate, like a clock keeping very precise time. I thought about 31 years of Sunday dinners and redirected conversations and the small surgical cuts of his approval withheld. I thought about the toast the night before. The groom. I thought about James, somewhere in this building, probably standing at a window in his dress uniform with that quality of calm he carried everywhere, talking to Colonel Marsh, thinking about nothing except the next hour and the woman he was about to marry and the life they were about to begin. James, who had never asked me to choose. James, who was about to walk into the most important hour of our shared life without knowing that the man who was supposed to give his daughter away had spent the winter trying to give her back. How many people know? My voice was entirely steady. I noticed this about it. Patrick, Marcus, me. Diane said. That's it, as far as I can tell. I nodded once. I looked back at the mirror. The woman looking at me was wearing my dress and my gardenias and my mother's bone structure, and she was not going to cry. Not here, not in this light, not in this room that smelled like promises. She was going to finish getting dressed, and she was going to walk downstairs, and she was going to marry James Alderman in front of every person she loved, and in front of the one person who had never deserved to be in that category, but who had occupied it by default for 31 years. And then she was going to deal with her father, not today, because today was not his. Today belonged to someone else entirely, but soon, and with everything she had. "Give me 5 minutes," I said to Diane. She nodded, stood, closed the door. I sat in the chair in the morning light and breathed. I breathed until the trembling in my hands stopped. I breathed until the cold thing in my chest stopped feeling like grief and started feeling like something harder and more useful. Something that would keep. And then I picked up my bouquet. White roses and eucalyptus, James's favorite scent, the one I had chosen precisely because of that. And I stood up and I went downstairs to get married. The ceremony began at 11 o'clock. The May morning was clear and unhurried. The sky a cloudless, unambiguous blue above the white columns of the plantation house, magnolias enormous in their bloom, petals drifting across the flagstones in slow handfuls. The guests filled the garden chairs in rows of white satin and fresh eucalyptus. James's unit sat to the right. 26 soldiers in dress blues, gold buttons catching the light, ribbons and medals in precise rows above their left breast pockets. And they had taken their seats with a quiet discipline that made several civilian guests turn to look at them the way you look at something you didn't expect to find beautiful and find beautiful anyway. I waited at the back of the aisle with Diane and my father. In the moments before the music began, I was aware of everything with an acuity that felt almost clinical. The weight of my bouquet, the slight give of flagstones beneath my heels, the smell of warm stone and gardenias. My father stood at my left, one hand offered for my arm, his face composed and appropriate. He looked, to anyone who didn't know him, like a proud father on his daughter's wedding day. He had the posture for it, the expression for it, the well-cut charcoal suit for it. Nothing about his exterior betrayed the phone call in January, or the toast the night before, or 31 years of strategic diminishment delivered in the measured cadences of a man who believed himself reasonable. I placed my hand on his arm and felt the stiffness in his elbow, the slight involuntary recoil of a man who has accepted a role he didn't choose. I thought very clearly, this is the last time I will arrange myself around your discomfort. After today, I am done. We walked. The guests rose. James turned at the end of the aisle, and when he saw me, whatever careful composure he had been maintaining shifted. Not dramatically, not with performance, but in the way of a man who has been holding himself very still and can, at last, release something. His eyes found mine and stayed there. He wore his dress blues, the dark coat with gold buttons, the ribbons and decorations in earned rows, captain's bars on the shoulders. He looked like what he was, a man who had done serious things seriously for a long time, for reasons that had nothing to do with recognition. I kept my eyes on his face the entire length of that aisle. I did not look at my father's side. I did not look at my father beside me. I looked only at James. At the altar, my father placed my hand in James's and stepped back. Colonel Marsh, officiating, welcomed the guests. James delivered his vows in a steady, quiet voice, every word chosen with the precision he brought to everything that mattered to him. He spoke about trust between two people who have each been tested and have not run, about commitment as a daily act rather than a single declaration. His hands holding mine were absolutely still. When I spoke, my voice did not waver. The vows lived in my body rather than my mind, and they came out of me not as recitation, but as something I was telling him directly, for the first time and for good. I watched his face receive every word with the same focused attention he had always brought to anything I said, and I thought, this is what it looks like when someone actually listens to you. I will not forget the difference. We exchanged rings. Colonel Marsh pronounced us married. James kissed me, brief, warm, deliberate, and the guests applauded, and the string quartet began the recessional. We turned to face the rows of standing guests, the May sky brilliant above the columns, the magnolias still at the garden's edge. Then Colonel Marsh raised one hand. The music stopped. I had not known this was coming. James had kept it as a gift, something he wanted me to receive without the weight of anticipation. I turned to look at him. He was watching the path that led from the garden gate to the main road, and in his expression, there was something I had never seen there before, something very close to relief. I turned to follow his gaze. They came through the garden gate in formation, 2 columns perfectly dressed, perfectly spaced, 150 United States Army soldiers moving across the flagstones with a precision that was felt as much as heard, their boots striking the ground in a low, steady rhythm that traveled up through the soles of my feet and into my chest. These were soldiers from James's previous units, men and women who had served under him across 3 deployments, who had traveled from bases in Georgia, Texas, North Carolina, and one who had flown overnight from Ramstein, Germany, because he heard the captain was getting married, and that was worth the flight. They came through the gate and stopped, 150 strong, in a formation that filled the garden path and spread across the lawn. The entire gathering fell into a silence so complete you could hear magnolia petals falling. Colonel Marsh's voice carried across the garden without amplification. Captain James Alderman has served this country for 11 years. He has led with integrity, with courage, and with a commitment to the soldiers beside him that is the finest I have witnessed in 30 years of service. These soldiers are not here because they were ordered to be. They are here because they chose to be. He paused. Company, present arms. 150 right hands rose to 150 foreheads in a single, synchronized movement. The sound of it a sharp, unified percussion like one hand against one surface. 150 pairs of eyes directed, without variance, at James and at me. Not at the guests, not at the minister, at us. The salute was held with the stillness of people who have been trained for conditions far more demanding than this, and in the silence of it, I became aware that I was shaking. Not with grief, not with fear, but with something warm and overwhelming that I could not fully name. James's hand, still holding mine, tightened. I looked up at him. His jaw was set, his eyes were bright, and he was looking out at the formation with the expression of a man who has been handed something he had not allowed himself to expect. I also became aware of my father. He was in the third row on the left side, and I became aware of him not because I looked at him directly, but because I was aware of the particular quality of air around a person who has just been struck silent. He was standing with the rest of the guests. His hands were at his sides. The expression on his face was not the face of a proud man, nor the dismissive man who had for years referred to the groom as your soldier. It was not the face of the man who had telephoned Marcus Holloway in January to suggest his daughter might be available. It was the face of a man who had miscalculated something very fundamental, and who understood at this moment the full scale of the error. He was simply still. Sergeant Major Collins, broad, compact, 31 years of service, turned to the formation and said in a voice measured and carrying and entirely without performance, "Soldiers, this officer kept every single one of us alive." He let that stand in the air. "Captain, congratulations, sir." Then a wide, unguarded smile broke across his face, and the garden erupted. The reception that followed had a quality I have never encountered at any other gathering, something that came from the specific combination of people who had each traveled a real distance to be present for someone they genuinely loved. Diane gave a toast that made half the room cry and the other half laugh in the same 4 sentences. James cut the wedding cake with his ceremonial saber and returned it to its scabbard with the same unhurried care he brought to everything. I watched his hands and thought I would never stop finding this quality beautiful. My father sat at his table through the afternoon with the contained, careful demeanor of a man who has revised his position but not yet found language for the revision. He did not approach me during the reception, and I did not approach him. The distance between us was not hostile. It was simply factual, a space that had always existed and that the afternoon had made visible in a way that couldn't be rendered invisible again by the usual mechanisms of family courtesy. Toward the end of the evening, the light going gold across the lawn, most of the soldiers gathered at the garden tent. My father found me at the magnolia tree on the lawn's edge, my shoes off, the grass cool under my feet, watching James with 3 of his soldiers across the garden. My father appeared at my side, and we stood together without speaking for a moment. The magnolias were enormous above us. "He earned those decorations," my father said. Not a question. "Every one of them," I said. "Twice over." A pause. I did not fill it. "I made a call in January to Marcus Holloway." He stopped. Started again. "I was wrong." I looked at him then, really looked, in the direct way I had trained myself not to do, because it always cost me something I didn't have spare. He was 63 years old, and in the afternoon light, he had the slightly diminished quality of a man whose authority has been quietly and conclusively removed, not by force, but by the revelation that it was never commensurate with what he had believed it to be. I did not feel satisfaction at his diminishment. What I felt was tiredness. The tiredness of a person who has been bracing for a long time and has finally, today, put the weight down. "You were wrong," I said. "Not just about the phone call, about all of it. About him. About what you chose to value for years and what you didn't." My voice was level. The anger had been there in the bridal suite this morning, and I had folded it into something cooler and more durable, something that wouldn't flare but wouldn't dissolve either. "He is a better man than anyone you have ever set against him in comparison. And I have spent a long time waiting for you to see that. And I have finally stopped waiting." My father was quiet. He looked at his shoes, then back at the lawn. "I know," he said. 2 words, nothing more comfortable than that. "I'm not ready to have the rest of this conversation today," I said. "But I want you to understand something. He is my family. He comes first. That is not a negotiation." He received this without argument, without appeal to sentiment or obligation. "I hear you, Clara," he said. Then, after a pause, something passed through his face that I recognized as what a man looks like when he finally puts down something he has been carrying too long. He's a good man. I can see that now. It cost him to say it. I let it cost him. I didn't make it easier, and I didn't make it harder. "Yes," I said. "He is." The following May, James was promoted to major at Fort Stewart. I sat in the front row in a blue dress, Eleanor Alderman holding my hand, her thumb moving over my knuckles in the same slow rhythm it had the first time she held my hands and told me she was grateful for me. In the photographs from that ceremony, James at attention as the colonel pinned the oak leaves to his shoulders. I look like what I am, a woman who knows exactly where she is and exactly why she is there, and who does not need anyone else's permission to be in that place. The following Christmas, when we drove to my father's house in Atlanta, he had framed one of the wedding photographs and placed it on the living room mantelpiece. It showed James and me beneath the arch of raised sabers, 8 officers with blades in paired symmetry above us, the Savannah light falling through the steel. Our faces turned toward each other, neither of us looking at the camera. My father didn't mention it. He didn't explain or annotate. He simply had it there, in the room where guests could see it when they came in, his daughter beneath an arch of steel, beside the man who had earned it. I looked at it for a long time while James and my father talked in the kitchen. I thought about 150 soldiers moving through a garden gate on a May morning, and about a silence so complete you could hear petals falling, and about the face of a man who had underestimated everything, his daughter, her husband, the particular weight of loyalty that is earned and cannot be purchased, and who had stood in that silence and finally, if not wholly or without cost, understood what he had almost missed. I never needed him to say he was sorry. What I needed was simpler and more durable than that. I needed to stop needing it. The day I stopped was the day I stood at the end of a garden aisle in a white dress with my hands full of white roses and eucalyptus, looking at a man who had already, long before that morning, shown me what it looks like when someone chooses you, not as a reflection of themselves, not as a performance of their own success, but as yourself, completely and without condition. That is the thing my father could not give me. That is the thing I stopped waiting for him to give me. And that is, finally, the thing I have.